yes or no. But, sometimes progress might not just be have you or haven't you achieved net zero. There's so much more nuance to it. Progress might actually mean I finally now have buy-in from this group. Now we can implement this particular initiative. This first initiative might be closer to getting us to the second initiative, which is even bigger. So those of us who are working in sustainability, that it's sort of this long haul. It's not a sprint. It is a constant marathon, right? And so just thinking about output versus outcomes isn't always effective. So a lot of this has to come back to, as you're putting this puzzle setting and puzzle solving in place, it is constantly thinking about what exactly is this next puzzle and then the next puzzle, etc., right? And constantly figuring out how do I solve this puzzle and unlock the next puzzle. I think of it more in terms of like gaming so that you're leveling up each time you solve the puzzle and you go on to the bigger puzzle. That's how you get to the 2050 net zero.
Welcome to Sustainability Transformations podcast, where we explore bold ideas to drive positive change for people, the community, and business. And today we are so blessed to have Radhika Dutt, author of the Radical Product Thinking Advisor to Monetary Authority of Singapore. We're going to explore Tyranny of Targets, how to set effective goals for sustainable organizations. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining. Why do so many organizations celebrate the paper wins while failing at the real change?
Thanks for having me, first of all, and I'm excited to be here. When we set goals and targets, one of the things that happens is we chase after what we've said we want to achieve. And on paper, we might achieve those numbers. And it's easy to celebrate those because we quantify it. And therefore, it makes it very binary. Have you or haven't you achieved it? And the paper wins make it feel like, yay, yes, we got this, right? But those paper wins actually kind of really hide some of the things that are less obvious. The example that I want to give is, the previous US CEO of Walmart, Greg Foran. He's now in New Zealand. But, when he was US CEO of Walmart, he was saying how profitability numbers at Walmart were looking great. Well, but they hide a lot of sins. Those were his words. Profitability hides a lot of sins in the sense that, those numbers in terms of profitability were looking good. But if you actually looked at the other numbers that are very relevant in terms of how's the business actually doing, those weren't doing as well at the time. So for example, if you look at the engagement from the store attendance, if you look at numbers like the number of items that were not restocked or empty shelves or bathrooms and how the bathroom quality is, right? A lot of those things are often very telling in terms of how is the business actually doing. And this is going back to your question, what happens with goals and targets? Often when we set goals and targets, the fundamental issue with that is we want to show those paper wins because all of our incentive is to show, ta-da, look, it's progress. We've made progress. Whatever initiative it was, it is working. That's the confirmation bias we all want to contribute to and say, hey, this is a win, hooray, right? And what happens is we're missing looking at all the bad metrics, let's say, that actually tell you what is wrong and what is not working.
What do we mean by the tyranny of targets? Just for the audience's sake, please.
Yeah, so the tyranny of targets is really this sort of performance theater that happens because when we set targets, everyone's incentive is to show that we've hit those targets. And what actually happens in an organization is it does two things. One is it drives people towards the short term. What I mean by that is when you set a target, you want to show that you've achieved it, and therefore you might take shortcuts in being able to show that you've achieved it. And so, first of all, in terms of the organization and what's actually good for the organization, because you're doing these short-term things just to show that you've hit goals, that's not necessarily good for the organization or frankly, even for society. So that's the first thing. But the second piece of this is, when the other high performers, the people who actually care about their work, when they see this sort of performance theater, when they see that their colleague, for example, is getting rewarded for doing something that you know is bad for the long term, but they've shown that they've hit targets, it really is demotivating for those high performers who care about their performance. So that's why, targets, the tyranny of targets is this double whammy. It drives us towards short term, which isn't good for the long term, for the company or for society. But two, that it demotivates the high performers who care about the quality of their work because they see that this is what gets rewarded.
Okay, so perhaps to give you a context around sustainability, where targets are very common are this retrospective reporting on sustainability outcomes. So a company may report, let's say in October 2025, their sustainability report, but this is actually backwards and this is all full of targets. So what are examples of organizations who are getting stuck in these performative results?
So I'll give you a couple of examples, and they don't come necessarily from sustainability, but I think it's very applicable to sustainability too, right? So I'll give you one example from a software company where, they had set a metric, a target rather. They'd set the target that, we want to improve code quality and increase the speed at which we're able to develop. And what this meant was we need to really write code that is well tested. So what did they set as a target? The target they set was get test coverage of 90%, meaning all the code that you write, there have to be test cases for it. 90% of the code has to be covered. So how was this achieved? In terms of short-term thinking, right? There was a leader who instructed all of his team to write bogus tests, to write tests that'll just, say, yes, everything is passed. And so for namesake, you have a bunch of test cases, but it hasn't actually improved code quality. So you have same bad code. In fact, now you have more bad code because you just have fake test cases. And so this is all numbers that are looking backwards and being able to show you, ta-da, we've hit those numbers. And what they actually said was, oh, this way we have more time to focus on adding new features. So this is one way of thinking. But in terms of sustainability, the ideas are very similar, right? That it might be sustainability numbers in terms of selling a certain number of carbon credits or buying a certain number of carbon credits. It is conducting X number of webinars or, press releases about it, signing agreements or partnerships, right? And all of those numbers are really easy to game, not necessarily because we want to game them, but rather because those are the incentives that are created, and it creates the short-term thinking that is around those metrics, as opposed to the long-term thinking. And this is the shift that I advocate for, is what is the puzzle we're trying to solve? So if I go back to this question, right, of code quality, and we were trying to say, okay, we want to write better code. The metric isn't what is the key thing to achieve. It's not about what is the test coverage achieved, right? We have to ask the question, have we actually written better code so that our software is more stable? In the sustainability world, right, it's a puzzle of, have we actually made things more sustainable? Like, what have we in reality achieved? And it may not just be those numbers, right? It may actually be something that is also qualitative, something we need to talk about and agree on as a team. Is this truly meaningful in terms of results? What is the puzzle we were setting out to solve? And this is the point, like targets versus being able to define the puzzle in terms of what is the problem or the observation and the opportunity for us to solve, that if we could just solve this problem, right, it could unlock this next thing, right? So thinking about it in this form of a puzzle and then being able to solve it. And we can talk about the framework for puzzle setting and puzzle solving, but moving towards the shift so that we're being more holistic in our thinking, that it's not just short term and ta-da, look, we've hit the numbers or achieved what we set out to, but rather, have we achieved the intent?
To expand more on, if there is a tyranny of targets and there is a school of thought that to be able to measure effectively or to be able to assess the performance of a system, of an activity, you have to set time-bound targets. So perhaps there may be some myth or misunderstanding there. So what is the alternative to the setting of the targets that you would say is more effective, and how we looking at short-term issues and long-term, and is there a need or there is no need to set targets for long-term, for example, in net zero in decarbonization, where you have a 2050 target or a 2050 date where this is the target of being reached. But before the 2050, there is a short term of 2030 achieving these key targets. So perhaps you can help. Now we know there is a problem. We've diagnosed it. What is the alternative solution?
Yeah. And I love this question of what is this alternative solution, right? Maybe the first thing that I'll share is how helpful are targets? Like, I think on the one hand, being able to say this is what we want to achieve by 2050, let's say net zero, it's helpful to communicate, what we are trying to get towards. But we haven't communicated what exactly are we going to do in the meanwhile. Like, how are we going to get there, right? And how are we going to get there is the big puzzle that's on hand that we need to solve. I think what happens often is we don't define that puzzle in the short term that we're really trying to solve. So what happens is targets are things that we see in the rearview mirror that we either hit it or we didn't hit it. But what do you do about it? That's the piece that's left unanswered. And so puzzle setting and puzzle solving helps make it a lot more actionable. So let's talk about what I mean by puzzle setting and puzzle solving. In terms of setting the puzzle, right, for sustainability, it might be the following. First of all, I will think about something slightly more short term. To be able to get to net zero, what is it that we need to unlock? Maybe part of it is there are groups within our own organization that really don't even buy into sustainability. We're thinking very short term. The puzzle maybe is, how do I get them on board? How can we really shift mindsets in terms of sustainability and take actionable steps towards that net zero, right? Because everything feels so far away. So if that is the puzzle that I have set, where I've defined what is the problem statement and what are some guiding questions. So the problem statement that I was defining was, that we don't really have a buy-in internally. We're not taking a serious effort towards this long-term plan. And so that is the problem statement. Some guiding questions might be things like, is it that we don't have buy-in from some of these key stakeholders, that they don't believe in it or agree with it? Two, maybe it's that they have different incentives altogether. Their incentives are very short term, whereas, we have the incentive to think long term in terms of sustainability. Maybe it is that some of these initiatives are so big that we need to take on that people feel like, I don't even know where to start. So why do I bother, right? Or like, that's why there isn't buy-in. There may be a bunch of guiding questions and reasons that we can think about in terms of this puzzle. What is this puzzle that we need to crack, right? Then comes puzzle solving. The puzzle solving aspect means asking three questions. So the first question is, how well did it work? So whatever it is that we tried, how well did it work? And notice that it's a very a nuanced question. It's not binary by saying like, are you or aren't you achieving this goal? It's not a yes-no question. It's how well is this initiative working? The second question is, what have we learned? This is where I say to teams, don't just throw me a bunch of statistics or data. Tell me, what is the story and the narrative? What have you really learned? And then the third question, which is that aha moment, based on how well it worked and based on what you learned, what will you try next? And so now let's go back to this puzzle that we're trying to figure out how to get buy-in from maybe these groups within the company that are completely against some of our sustainability efforts. So how well did it work? So maybe what we had tried was a certain kind of messaging, and we had shared certain long-term plans in terms of sustainability. What did we discover in terms of how well did it work? Maybe that messaging didn't resonate at all. And, just people don't feel like these are the right initiatives. So, okay. Well, that's a bit of a bummer. How well did it work? That didn't work well. So what did we learn? Maybe this is where we figure out what are those key things that really did not resonate? Was it a matter of messaging? Maybe what we needed to do was get more buy-in. Maybe it was smaller starting points, or maybe we needed to get buy-in from the CEO and have him push or her push for a different way of thinking across these other groups. Maybe that was what tanked that meeting. We talk about what did we learn in terms of, what are some takeaways based on how things went that is now going to inform what we're going to do next. And so now in terms of what will we try next, maybe this is what we have to do next, where we go back to the CEO and we tell her about kind of this different approach. What can we do? Where we need the support to get the sort of alignment. Maybe those are groups that we're going to talk to in advance and figure out how we drive this. Maybe those initiatives are a bit different in terms of they can it aligns with their incentives as well. Ways to align with their incentives. So my point is, this puzzle setting and puzzle solving parts, we constantly evaluate how well is it working, what have we tried, or what have we learned, what will we try next. And that is what helps us actually achieve results that whatever, either we're setting targets for the long term, but whether or not it's targets, the point is, it's this puzzle setting and puzzle solving that drives real meaningful progress as opposed to just setting targets. This is where James Cleary, the author of Atomic Habits, he says, Olympians have goals. All job candidates have goals. It's not the winner. It's not goals that differentiates the winners from the losers. It's really a certain set of processes that you commit to. It's a system of processes. And this puzzle setting and puzzle solving gives you that.
The first two steps were reviewing. But what about if you're starting from day one? Let's say a company wants to set up their net zero plan for 2040 or 2050, and it's day one. How do they explore that puzzle setting? Because here they do not have anything to look at what has worked and what hasn't worked. Is there any way to adapt that puzzle setting and the puzzle solving in order to have an effective achievement of those targets or non-targets, as you would say?
I love this question, and maybe we can workshop this together right here on the podcast, right? Let's try that exercise.
Yeah.
So maybe, you can start with the background in terms of what are some examples of things that a startup might be thinking of. And let's just workshop it together in terms of how might you set puzzles from some of those things that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so from a sustainability and a net zero perspective, it's about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions based on the processes of the organization. So, for example, switching from a gas-powered heating of the offices into a solar-powered heating of the offices. So that would be an example of they'll have a target, or our goal is to replace existing fossil-based heating system or cooling system with a renewable alternative powered by solar, or a more sustainable option like heat pump system. So
right. And so there might be changes that you're thinking about within your office and how you're heating your building or how much water you're using, et cetera, right? And what kind of faucets you have to be able to save water and things like that. So, one thing that I find in organizations is when a leader just sets a target saying, here's what we want to achieve, everyone then sort of chases those targets, and you may or may not actually have that buy-in, right? Feel like people are saying in words that, yes, we're going to do this. You may not internally truly have that buy-in. You might find people doing this for namesake only. So a puzzle that I might set as a leader is, we would like to reduce our carbon footprint. Here are some ways that we could do that. One is figuring out how we're doing heating within the building. And the puzzle is, what all could we do to reduce our carbon footprint as much as possible? So I would start with that puzzle, right? And I would ask my team to come up with research that helps me understand kind of their thinking around this. And they can present this information to me along these three lines. How well did it work? What have we learned? What will we try next, right? So my team might come back and say, okay, before we switch to doing heat pumps and this and that, one easy way might be, we just found that this utility company, they allow you to pick just renewable sources for or heating or whatever it is. They allow you to take this renewable energy source and select only that. So maybe that is our starting point. That in itself helps us to this extent. Here's the cost of it. This is what we learned. This is what it would mean in terms of our budgeting. Okay, so maybe that is the puzzle setting and puzzle solving creates buy-in from your team, because now they're thinking about how to solve the problem. They take ownership of it as opposed to just trying to hit numbers for namesake, right? So getting teams to own it by presenting both the puzzle and then different parts of the teams might own actually different pieces of the puzzle. So, for example, the product team might come back and say, we were thinking about using AI for these aspects of the product. And now, like based on this is our puzzle that we want to reduce carbon emissions, maybe this is how we can minimize the use of AI while still having an effective product. It becomes, now all of a sudden, we have not just set the puzzle for only how are we heating the office, right? But it is pieces of the puzzle that different parts of the organization take away.
That's great. So what learning focused or puzzle focused framework would you recommend for organizations to use to solve these puzzles?
So, and I'm so glad for this question, because when I just use the words puzzle setting and puzzle solving, it often sounds for people like this just means, you're saying off to the playground, come back when you're done solving this puzzle, have fun in the meanwhile. Whereas the reality is there's a lot of rigor around this. And hopefully you've heard that rigor as I talk through this in terms of really being able to present, how well did it work? What have I learned? What will I try next? Right. And so the framework that I use for this is what I call OHLs. It stands for objectives, hypotheses, and learnings. And so objectives is the summary of that puzzle that I just described, where we describe, this is the problem that we're observing, and here's the opportunity and why we want to solve this opportunity, right? So this is the puzzle that we're setting out to solve. So in this case, the way we described, we want to reduce our carbon footprint. And how might we do that, whether it's through how we're heating the building or, how we are creating this product, etc. Like, how might we reduce our carbon footprint? So that's the puzzle setting. So you use objectives to summarize, and the hypotheses and learnings are what we're structuring in this structure of how well is it working? What have I learned? What will I try next, right? So hypotheses are what you define so that you really understand how well did it work, because you have to define it working. So the hypotheses help you define what do you mean by how well did it work, right? Like, what is it that you tried? And the hypothesis in this case might be, if we try to find a utility company that provides us electricity in this way, it may be cheaper than heat pumps. And so that is sort of that was the hypothesis, right? And this is something that you would have to try out, learn from it, and then you describe what you're going to do next. And the learnings are what you're structuring under what did we learn and what will we try next based on these learnings. So this is the framework: objectives, hypotheses, and learnings, that I call OHLs. And there's a free template that people can download that we can share in the show notes. And you can use this template to be able to share both the puzzle that you want to work on as well as how you're solving the puzzle.
We hear a lot about outputs, results, outcomes, which is better based on achieving the goal that we've set out to do.
Yeah, it is so interesting that we get so stuck on this difference between output, outcome, results, etc. And I hear what you're saying, right? And I hear this sort of a question so often in the corporate world too. Oh yeah, we need to focus on outcomes and not output, etc. But how do you define those things? And if we step back for a moment, right? If I look at it intuitively, when you have a puzzle in front of you, when you look at a Rubik's Cube, you can tell, am I closer to solving this or not, right? You start to feel intuition that I am getting closer to the answer or not, right? And so I'm not saying that this is based just on a gut feel. Metrics and measuring is super important, but a lot of it is also the analysis of what are those metrics telling you actually. So what happens in a lot of companies that claim to be data-driven is that we somehow magically expect this data to tell us, are we closer to achieving this outcome or not? For example, in terms of revenues that, we expect, so there's a very clear answer. Have you or haven't you achieved this revenue? We look at higher revenues as the outcome that we want. Coming back to sustainability, it might be, have we gotten closer to net zero, yes or no? But, sometimes progress might not just be have you or haven't you achieved net zero. There's so much more nuance to it. Progress might actually mean I finally now have buy-in from this group. Now we can implement this particular initiative. This first initiative might be closer to getting us to the second initiative, which is even bigger. So those of us who are working in sustainability, that it's sort of this long haul It's not a sprint. It is a constant marathon, right? And so just thinking about output versus outcomes isn't always effective. So a lot of this has to come back to, as you're putting this puzzle setting and puzzle solving in place, it is constantly thinking about what exactly is this next puzzle and then the next puzzle, etc., right? And constantly figuring out, how do I solve this puzzle and unlock the next puzzle? I think of it more in terms of like gaming, so that you're leveling up each time you solve the puzzle and you go on to the bigger puzzle. That's how you get to the 2050 net zero.
As companies are grappling with navigating metrics to meaningful impact, so in sustainability, whether it's the natural capital like clothing manufacturing company, the cotton they have to buy from the growing from farmers, or the supply chain, or the human resources team, or the human capital of people, their well-being, from resilience of their employees or burnout challenges, which, by the way, sustainability of late, we are hearing a lot about those. But I think in general, using these examples, how can sustainability leaders redesign their executive metrics so it's not falling into the tyranny of targets, delivering the absolute solutions? So this time looking at this natural capital, human capital, and those resilience key factors.
One thing that I'll say is really helpful is facilitating discussions using vocabulary that really helps people visualize the long term versus short term, right? Because sustainability is constantly this push and pull between long term versus short term needs. And so it's this yin and yang, because I think just before we even started this podcast, you were talking about how we have to do this long-term stuff, but we also have to think about short-term needs so that we survive long enough to do the stuff, right? One way to make that very explicit for the team in terms of the trade-offs of long-term versus short-term, it's this yin and yang that you can make explicit on an X and Y axis, where the Y axis, right, is the long-term. It's your vision of what you want to work towards. And that includes things like sustainability. That is all part of this long term. So that's the y-axis. And the x-axis is survival. This is where you're thinking about survival for your organization, whether it's a nonprofit or a corporate world. There's the immediate short-term survival, whether it's because stakeholders continue to fund it as a nonprofit or it's revenues for for-profit company, right? Survival is that x-axis. And the quadrants that emerge from this 2x2 of x and y is things that are good for the vision and survival. Those are the easy decisions, right? Those are decisions that you're hardly ever questioning, but it's great to see that visually in the easy decisions quadrant. Then there are the decisions that are in the what I call the vision debt quadrant. This is stuff that is good for the short term, right? Maybe it's bringing in revenues. Maybe it is bringing in more funding. You're doing something for the short term. Let's say you're a company and you're applying AI, and that's going to get you more revenues. But, if you think about sustainability, you're really adding to your carbon footprint, right? And the opposite of that is vision debt. Maybe this is, so vision debt is basically where it's good for the long-term vision, but it's not great for the short-term survival. So an example of this might be, if I'm going to do the work to be able to minimize how much I'm using AI, being very careful with what is that AI query that I'm creating, I might redesign the product or refactor aspects of it, etc., to minimize the number of tokens I'm using. All of that work, it's not helpful in the short term because I'm not creating more revenues by doing this work, by being thoughtful about how I use AI, but it's good for my long-term vision. As someone working in sustainability, it is really helpful to think about this long-term versus short-term and facilitate conversations in your organization rather than just focusing on metrics. Talk about the initiatives that you want to drive towards and how often they might be either in the easy decisions quadrant, they might be investing in the vision quadrant or vision debt even, right? If you're trying to just write a report that shows investors like, hey, here's how good we've been. Yeah, that's great. It helps with the investment, but that's not time spent on your vision necessarily. Like it's a little bit of vision debt. You might want as a sustainability professional to do something that is way out there in the investing in the vision quadrant. Maybe it is really hard to do. You don't get enough support. for it, but it's really good for the vision. How might you be able to break it down so that it's less far out in the investing in the vision quadrant? You bring it a little bit closer to easier decisions, right? Those are the kinds of questions you could ask and unpack with your team. And this sort of a vocabulary really helps you to be able to get everyone on the same page, align on vision versus survival.
About your book, what other concepts which I haven't asked that you think sustainability leaders, sustainability enthusiasts can learn from based on our discussion?
So I'll first mention the Radical Product Thinking book. I talked about vision versus survival. What is really important is also defining vision with a lot of clarity. I think one thing that happens in sustainability, but also honestly in all sorts of organizations, our vision for sustainability sometimes is very broad. And while it is important to have this holistic perspective, sometimes it is also helpful to really define what we mean by sustainability in ways that is super tangible for people in a way that they can truly identify with it. So in the Radical Product Thinking book, there's a fill in the blanks framework, right, that helps you answer. So today, when this identified group of people have this problem, this is what they do. This is the world that we envision. And why must you solve this problem? That piece of why is the status quo unacceptable? We often in sustainability don't have alignment on why is the status quo unacceptable? Why must we do something about this problem, right? Because everything is so long term. We keep thinking, like humans just usually think about the next predator that's going to be chasing after us. Like we have a hard time thinking about that long term. Writing a detailed vision statement that is not just, that doesn't just sound abstract in terms of sustainability, making it very real in terms of problem statement, why it must be solved, what is the end state, and how are we going to bring this about? So this is the Radical Product Thinking vision statement. So take some time to just think through that. And that sort of clarity in terms of vision makes it a lot easier to get buy-in and bring people with you on the journey.
Looking at the writing of the book, at what stage in your career or moment in your work did it really dawn on you that perhaps you are so inspired about sharing those ideas and compiling it into a book?
I never thought, honestly, that I'd ever want to be a writer. Definitely not after, after studying engineering, right? So what drove me to write Radical Product Thinking was a lot of hard lessons in my career, having made mistakes and caught what I call product diseases along the way, where you see good products go bad because of these diseases, and learning through those hard lessons, how do you build good products? That's what led me to write Radical Product Thinking. But it's written in a way that, anyone can think about their work as a product. Meaning, let's say you're working on sustainability, your answer to me might be, but I don't work on a product. How can I use Radical Product Thinking? The product you're working on is your mechanism for creating the change you want to bring to the world. If you're working on sustainability and your mechanism for creating that is your product. That is how you're reducing the carbon footprint, etc. It's all of your efforts or your activism, whatever it is, that might be your product. And this book is about how do you create that change very systematically so that your vision is translated into everyday activities. So that's what led me to the first book. And the second book I'm working on is about, why goals and targets don't work and what actually works. And this is the puzzle setting and puzzle solving that I've arrived at because I found that that's what actually drives better business results and not just goal setting. And so that second book, is something that's in the works. If you use the OHLs toolkit, and now you have a link to it in the show notes, but if you use the OHLs toolkit, you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn and tell me about your experiences with OHLs, and your case studies might just make it into the book as I work on it. So I'd always love to hear from our listeners.
Thank you, Radhika, for your time and incredible insight. I know you shared about the book and where to find you, but if you can summarize, where can listeners find more of your work?
So Radical Product Thinking, you can look that up on Amazon. It's in audiobook, ebook, as well as print. You can find that on Amazon or any other bookstore near you. Ideally, find it in a local bookstore. But also, you can download the OHL's toolkit from radicalproduct.com. It's from Toolkits, and you'll find the OHL's toolkit. And reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Radhika Dutt on LinkedIn, and I'll share a link for that as well.
Thanks, Radhika, and thank you for listeners. If you enjoyed this conversation, please don't forget to subscribe and share this episode with a colleague or a friend who is wrestling with short-term metrics. Is the best way to spread these insights further. Thank you so much.